At the peak of the Cold War, this pact wasn't just a military alliance. It was a powerful tool that helped a 20th century world superpower keep an iron grip on Eastern Europe. It crushed rebellions, controlled nations, and stood head-to-head with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, the US-led military alliance of Western Europe. But why did the United States fear this alliance so much? And how did this mighty weapon of the Soviet Union vanish without a trace? This is the truth behind what happened to the Warsaw Pact. But wait, what exactly was it? To understand that, we need to go back to the aftermath of World War II, a time when Europe was split in two, East and West. But why was Europe divided? On one side, you had the United States and its Western European allies, who formed NATO in 1949. NATO was a defense alliance, built to protect its members from any outside threats, particularly from the Soviet Union and the spread of communism. But how did the Soviet Union react to NATO? You'd think they would have responded right away, right? But oddly enough, they didn't. In fact, in 1954, the Soviet Union actually requested to join NATO, but this proposal was rejected by the United States. It wasn't until 1955 that the Warsaw Pact came into play. What triggered it after all those years? The key moment came when West Germany joined NATO. To the Soviet Union, a rearmed West Germany, backed by the United States and other Western powers, was a serious threat. They couldn't just sit by and watch. So, in response, the Soviets moved quickly. Just days after West Germany's NATO entry, the Warsaw Pact was signed on May 14, 1955. But what exactly was this pact, and why did the Soviet Union feel it was necessary? The Warsaw Pact wasn't your typical military alliance. So, what made it different? It wasn't just about defense. The Soviet Union had a much bigger goal in mind. Their primary aim? To strengthen their control over Eastern Europe. But how did they go about this? Well, officially, the pact was called the Treaty of Friendship, Cooperation, and Mutual Assistance. Sounds friendly enough, right? But was it really about friendship? Not quite. Beneath the surface, the pact was all about ensuring the Soviet Union could keep a tight grip on its neighboring countries. So, who were the members? The original signatories included the Soviet Union, Albania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, Poland, and Romania. But did everyone stay loyal? Not exactly. Albania withdrew in 1968 after disagreements with the Soviet Union, but the rest of the countries remained part of the pact throughout most of the Cold War. Was the Warsaw Pact truly about mutual defense? On paper, yes, but in reality, the pact had a hidden agenda. It was less about protecting its members from outside attacks, and more about making sure none of them veered away from communism and the influence of the USSR. But how did the Soviet Union ensure control? The Warsaw Pact's military forces were unified under a single command, and guess who was in charge? A Soviet officer. This meant that while the other nations were part of the pact, Moscow always had the final say in any military decisions. What was one of the biggest differences between NATO and the Warsaw Pact? It came down to how much independence each member had. In NATO, countries could make their own decisions when it came to politics and military actions. But in the Warsaw Pact, things were very different. Why? Because the Soviet Union was in charge. Even though the member countries were technically independent, they were often treated more like Soviet-controlled states. So, was the Warsaw Pact just about military power? Not exactly. It was also an ideological weapon. The Warsaw Pact wasn't just the Soviet Union's answer to NATO. It was a tool that helped divide the world into two sides: communism and capitalism. NATO represented Western capitalism, while the Warsaw Pact stood for Soviet-style communism. This wasn't just about countries, it was about two competing worldviews. But did the Soviet Union only worry about threats from the West? Not at all. The Warsaw Pact wasn't just used to defend against outside forces. It was also used to keep control within the Eastern Bloc. What happened when countries within the pact started to resist Soviet control? One of the most infamous uses of the Warsaw Pact was to crush uprisings in its own member states. So, what happened in Hungary in 1956? Hungary decided to push back against Soviet influence, demanding reforms and even threatening to leave the Warsaw Pact entirely. This was a huge problem for the Soviet Union. Losing control of Hungary could lead to other countries trying to break free too. So, how did the Soviet Union respond? They couldn't let Hungary go. Soviet-led Warsaw Pact forces quickly invaded Hungary to stop the revolution. It was brutal. Thousands were killed or imprisoned, and Hungary was forced back under Soviet control. If you're enjoying this video so far, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more content like this. And that wasn't the only time the Warsaw Pact was used like this. In 1968, Czechoslovakia also tried to make changes during a period known as the Prague Spring. The country wanted more political freedom and reforms, which made the Soviet Union nervous. Why? Because the Soviet leaders feared that if one country broke away, others might follow. So once again, Warsaw Pact forces, mostly Soviet, but also from Hungary, Poland, and Bulgaria, invaded Czechoslovakia to shut down the reforms. Did every country go along with these invasions? No, actually. Romania refused to take part, and Albania protested so strongly that it left the Warsaw Pact entirely. These events showed that the Warsaw Pact wasn't just about protecting its members from outside threats. It was also about keeping them in line. If a country tried to step out of line, the Soviet Union was more than willing to use military force to pull them back. While the Warsaw Pact was a political tool, it also had real military power. But how strong was it? During the Cold War, both NATO and the Warsaw Pact were involved in an arms race. This meant each side was constantly building up weapons, soldiers, and military equipment in case a war broke out. The fear of war hung over Europe, and both sides poured enormous resources into defense. By 1987, the Warsaw Pact's military might was impressive, at least on paper. The Soviet Union and its allies had huge armies, thousands of tanks, and plenty of aircraft. But were all the members equally strong? Not really. While countries like Poland and East Germany had capable militaries, others were seen as weaker and less reliable. So, who was really in charge? The Soviet Union, of course. The other Warsaw Pact members often relied heavily on Soviet leadership, funding, and equipment. In contrast, NATO members had more independence. While the United States was the biggest power in NATO, the other countries still had more control over their own military decisions, often disagreeing on important issues. This flexibility was one of NATO's strengths, while the Warsaw Pact's dependence on the Soviet Union became one of its biggest weaknesses. So, what led to the fall of the Warsaw Pact? By the late 1980s, things were changing fast in Eastern Europe. The pact, once a symbol of Soviet control, was starting to break apart. Why? A mix of economic problems and growing dissatisfaction with the Soviet Union made it clear that the pact was on its last legs. But the big turning point? The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. When the wall came down, it wasn't just a German event. Communist governments across Eastern Europe started collapsing one by one. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany all began to distance themselves from Soviet control. What did that mean for the Warsaw Pact? These countries began stepping away from the alliance too. What happened next? In 1990, East Germany left the pact as it prepared to reunify with West Germany. Soon after, Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia stopped participating in Warsaw Pact military exercises. The political changes across Eastern Europe made the alliance seem irrelevant. So when did it officially end? By 1991, the Warsaw Pact was over. It was formally declared dissolved on February 25th, and by July 1st, it was gone for good. A few months later, in December 1991, the Soviet Union itself collapsed, marking the end of the Cold War. What did the end of the Warsaw Pact mean? It signaled the end of Soviet control in Eastern Europe. The countries that had once been controlled by the Soviet Union were now free to choose their own paths. Many, like Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, later joined NATO, something that would have been unthinkable during the Cold War. Even though the Warsaw Pact dissolved in the early 1990s, its legacy continues to shape geopolitics to this day. But if you found this video interesting, make sure to click on the next one for more unbelievable stories from history.